We are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret society, opposed to secret oaths, opposed to secret proceedings, secret proceedings. No official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know.
Welcome to Conspiracy Corner Podcast, everyone. This is Abe, your host. It is 6 a.m., October 17th, 2021. Just got off work. It's honestly been a pretty chill day. Just went as fast as I could. Just too much stuff on the truck. I had to take back like 4 pallets. Yeah, I think I might have irritated my boss. We had a meeting the other night. He said we could start coming in early if we wanted because the store hours are changing. So I came in at 9 and got off at 5 and while I'm still busting my ass. So I don't know. I'm just the type that I'm just quiet and I just deal with it and get taken advantage of, sadly. Here's some crazy shit that happened today. I was in drive-thru getting my dinner for the night, and some dude in front of me got to the second window, got a drink, and then slammed it into the window. So I thought that was pretty crazy. I put out a podcast on the way to work today. Well, yesterday for you all because I work third. I did not really complete the story. But honestly, there wasn't really much left to say, so I'm just going to put it out as it is because I'm not going to redo an entire 30-minute podcast. There wasn't really much to add to the story. So check out that episode if you want. It does cut off a little bit at the end, but I mean, it's a full podcast. The story was pretty much over anyways. There was no crazy conclusion or anything. But it's just biker stories, just different encounters with different bikers that I've had throughout the years. Just 2 encounters, really. But, I don't know. Interesting, crazy stories that just have to do with my life. Nothing about paranormal or conspiracy or anything like that. But just something I thought y'all would want to check out. It is October, so like I said, we're focusing on true crime, paranormal, stuff like that. Halloween-related stuff. We are doing Letters from Hell, which is basically we're going to cover another murder by Jack the Ripper, and then we're going to get into the letters that he was writing to the police. But yeah, I hope you all enjoy. So let's get into another Ripper murder. This is the murder of Mary. At the beginning of the 1860s, a number of narrow streets thickly populated with thieves, prostitutes, and beggars were removed. Essex Street and Old Rose Lane disappeared, and the broad span of New Commercial Street was built, linking Shoreditch to the London docks, cutting across Whitechapel, and in particular through the midst of a densely populated area. It could have been an opportunity for change. Indeed, there were a few social reformers who tried to encourage the spread of respectable lodgings, at the same time discouraging the majority of disreputable establishments. It was a forlorn task. Spitalfields had been a notorious rookery for infamous characters for more than 2 centuries, and as the navies cut through their thoroughfare, sweeping courts, alleys, and tenements before them, so the human flotsam merely regrouped on either side of New Commercial Street. By the time of the Whitechapel murders, Spitalfields Rookery was as firmly established as it had been before the planners' improvements. 400 square yards was home to 800 thieves, vagabonds, beggars, and whores, most of them who had lived previously in the notorious Essex streets and Old Rose Lane. From George Yard, where Martha Tabram had been found, over Wentworth Street, and past the roads and alleys whose names feature in all the crimes, Thrall Street, Flower and Dean Street, Fashion Street, the new road cut its way northward, slashing a great scar through the heart of Whitechapel. Towards the south of Spitalfields Market was one of the most dangerous thieves' hideouts. Coiners' dens were in every street, and publicans frequently doubled as receivers of stolen goods. In small yards and skittle grounds behind the taverns, fighting dogs were chained to kennels before entering wooden enclosures to kill rats or each other. The audience for these events could number as many as 100, all coarse and brutal in appearance. Many would be known to each other, partners in crimes. Here a stranger walked at his own peril, and could not hope to go unnoticed. Many areas of this part of Spitalfields were considered so dangerous that even the men of the H Division would not venture in alone. In the very center of this purlieu, opposite Flower and Dean Street, with its dozens of threepence-a-night lodgings and bordering the vast meat market of Spitalfields, was Dorset Street, a narrow road with barely sufficient room for 2 carriages to pass. Not that many carriages came this way. The odd coster barrow, perhaps, but the swells and the hansoms didn't loiter here. Virtually all the houses provided lodgings for people who would come late at night to disappear again, mostly to illegal pursuits during the day. Off Dorset Street, a brick tunnel about 3 feet wide formed a miserable dark alley extending 20 feet from the street into a small yard barely 15 feet wide. This was Miller's Court. On the corner of the court, running the length of the alley and fronting Dorset Street, was McCarthy's chandler's shop, which gave the place its local name, McCarthy's Rents. John McCarthy owned 2 of the 6 mean houses in the court. The houses in Dorset Street backed onto the court, through which its occupants of the rear rooms would enter. One such place was number 26 Dorset Street, whose ground floor had been partitioned to form number 13 Miller's Court, a dismal, sparsely furnished room which was rented by Mary Jane Kelly. Mary had occupied the room since the previous March. Although described as the lowest form of prostitute, Mary must have had some redeeming qualities, for not only had she kept the room for some 8 months, she had even been allowed by her landlord to fall into arrears with her rent. This was an area where many rents were collected by the day, but Mary was obviously held in some trust by McCarthy, for she owed 29 shillings for a week's rent. The Ripper investigator, Donald Rumbelow, author of The Complete Jack the Ripper, has observed that as the majority of the women in McCarthy's Rents were prostitutes, it is possible that the money was more than just rent payment. Even so, it was considerable amount to have outstanding. In a part of London riddled with disease and poverty, Mary shone like a beacon. A Celtic beauty with raven black waist-length hair and blue eyes. Her bearing and youthful attractiveness made her a remarkable and instantly recognizable figure in the area. She was short, about 5 foot 3 inches, and attractively rounded, if not a little plump. The paths of the prostitutes that had brought her from Ireland to Cardiff, to the bordellos of Haymarket, she claimed, and a pair more in Paris had ended, temporarily at least, in the cesspool that was Miller's Court. Mary's room was about 12 feet and contained a few sticks of shabby rented furniture comprising an iron bedstand, 2 rickety tables, and 1 single chair. Torn muslin served as curtains at the broken window that looked out onto the court. Here Mary lived with with a man she called her husband, Joseph Kelly. In fact, he was Joseph Barnett, a kindly enough man who had picked her up in Commercial Street nearly 2 years before. They had instantly agreed to live together, and this they had done, with occasional tiffs such as the one in which the window had gotten broken, until October 30th, 9 days before. There had been rumors that Mary was involved in the considerable sapphism that abounded amongst her calling. Certainly, she would have been aware of the clubs in the West End that catered for such women. There were those that said that her intimacies with a woman called Maria Harvey, who lived at Newcourt off Dorset Street, went beyond that of friendly neighbors who shared a pipe or two at the Britannia. Such behavior was commonplace enough among certain of her kind, and was taken very much for granted. Wearing queer drawers would, quote unquote, would scarcely have raised an eyebrow in those squalid streets. Even so, it was scarcely surprising that Joe Barnett should object. When Maria moved in, Joe moved out. For Mary, one Thursday was much like any other. She would have numerous penny drinks at the Britannia, fatigued after her daytime meetings with customers, unbeknown to Joe, who was at the market. Later, she would stagger home on Joe's arm at about 1 o'clock in the morning. Last night had been different. It was more than a week since Joe had stormed off to his sister's place in Grey Inns Road. Mary missed him. She was sure he'd be back. He was a good man and cared for her. Why, only that evening he'd call in to tell her he was sorry not to have any money for her, work being what it was. He'd be back, she was sure. Meanwhile, the night was still young. She could hear the clock on St. Stephen's at Spitalfields. It was 2 a.m. Mary tossed her long, narrow red cape over her shoulders. It hung to the floor, covering the shabby skirt and velvet top. The coat was getting difficult to button. At 3 months pregnant, her waist was filling out rapidly. It was raining slightly as Mary crossed New Commercial Street, and she scarcely noticed the short, stout figure with the black hat at the corner of Thrall Street. His voice was soft. "Hello, Mary." "Hello, Hutchinson." Mary smiled. "Just the man I wanted to see. I'm so down. Will you lend me a tanner?" Hutchinson laughed, a hollow, empty laugh that sent his breath streaming on the cold night air. "Sixpence? I haven't even enough for a bed myself. I've been down in Rumford all day, and there's bugger all work down there for anyone. I'd help if I could, but I can't." Mary smiled at him again. "Sure, I know you would. Ah, well, good morning to you. I must go and find some money." She turned away and began to walk towards Thrall Street. Hutchinson stood and watched her. He'd known Mary for 3 years and had a soft spot for the likable, vivacious Irish charmer. She had not gone more than a dozen steps when a man coming towards her stopped her and put his hand on her arm. They paused for a moment, and the man put his arm around her as they walked back towards Hutchinson. The curled ends of the stranger's mustache bobbed up and down as the couple shared some laughter. The man was about 35, not much taller than Mary, about 5'6", and Hutchinson felt distinctly uneasy about him. From his high button boots and spats to the horseshoe pin flashing in his black tie, he looked a mite too smartly togged out for Whitechapel. The long dark coat was expensively trimmed at collar and cuffs, with a strass gun, and beneath its heavy gold chain dangled from the light waistcoat to end in a shimmering red jewel that glowed in the gaslight like the eye of some tormented animal. Hutchinson tried to look the stranger in the face as they passed him, but the man pulled his soft felt hat further over his eyes, shielding his face from a thin parcel about 8 inches long and wrapped in a dark, shiny American cloth. In his right hand he carried a pair of brown kid gloves. They stood talking at the corner of Miller's Court, and Hutchinson followed at a distance. Mary's voice rippled clearly in the cold night air. "All right, my dear, come along. You'll be comfortable." The man leaned over and kissed her. Hutchinson watched Mary straighten up, complaining that she had lost her handkerchief. With a flourish, the stranger produced a red one and pressed it into her hand. They linked arms and made their way into the court. Hutchinson assumed that they had gone into Mary's room, number 13. What prompted Hutchinson to wait, he couldn't tell. He just felt uneasy. He had nowhere to go for the night and was curious to see when the stranger would leave. But after 3/4 of an hour, with the cold November wind tugging at his thin jacket, Hutchinson called it a night. He left just before 3 a.m. In the chandler's shop on the corner of Miller's Court, a round figure was stacking boxes. It was almost 11 a.m., and Thomas Bowyer had been at the task since the shop had opened some hours before. Behind the counter, John McCarthy was checking the cash drawer and muttering angrily about outstanding money. He pushed the drawer shut noisily and looked up at his assistant. "Tom, go around to number 13. Ask Mary Jane for the rent, and don't take no for an answer." Bowyer straightened up. It was a welcome break from the morning's work. He liked Mary, and it wasn't the first time he'd called her for rent. But there was often a problem. The sun was shining brightly as he stopped out of the shop and down into the alley into Miller's Court. A small group of shabbily dressed men squatted on the concrete paving, playing pitch and toss, coins changing hands and anxious heads turning this way and that, wary of any police approaching. Bowyer knocked at the faded door. He watched the gamblers idly for a moment and then turned back to the door. He knocked again, harder this time. He tried the handle, but it was locked. It crossed his mind that Mary was expecting his errand and might be ignoring his knocking. Just around the corner was a window in 4/4. He peered through the grimy glass, but the curtains were drawn. The lower of the 4 panes, the one nearest the door, was broken. Gingerly, Bowyer put his hand through and lifted the tattered muslin. In the chandler's shop, McCarthy licked his pencil as he put the finishing touches to a column of figures in the narrow ledger. He paused and looked around him. This morning was quiet. The annual Lord Mayor's shop was taking place, and the side streets around Spitalfields were deserted as the inhabitants massed in the main street to watch the procession. Golden coaches didn't often visit, but today the new Lord Mayor would pass through on his journey from the mansion house to the Guildhall for the swearing-in. McCarthy's shop door was open, and he could hear the crowds in Leadenhall Street singing and shouting. Suddenly the disheveled figure of his assistant appeared in the doorway. Pale, shaking, and wild-eyed, he swayed and steadied himself against the door. "Governor, governor! Come quick, number 13. Oh, my God, Jack the—" He clamped his hand over his mouth and reeled into the street. McCarthy ran after him. Down the passage and into the court, Bowyer pointed speechlessly to the window, and McCarthy whisked aside the curtain. In the gloom of the unlit interior, he could see the shape on the bed. As his eyes adjusted from the bright sunlight, its form became clearer, and the horror of the scene drew sharply into focus. A mass of raw flesh, like some butcher's carcass, lay stretched upon the bed. That it had been human, could be made out only from the shape, for the face had been skinned. The ears and the nose had been cut off, and the head hung sideways, grotesquely severed by the deep slash that had rent the throat from ear to ear. The remains of a linen undergarment clung to the corpse. The abdomen had been ripped partially open, and both breasts had been cut off from the body. Like the head, the left arm hung to the body by the skin only. The thighs down to the feet had been stripped of flesh, and McCarthy could see the leg bones gleaming white. The abdomen had been slashed across and downward, and most of the internal organs were removed. One arm and hand had been plunged into the mess that had been her stomach. Blood had spurted across 3 of the 4 walls and lay in a pool beneath the body and under the bed. McCarthy felt his pulse hammering in his temples. Draped around the room from every picture rail, the bloody entrails hung suspended like some awful Yuletide decoration. The final horror struck the grocer as his eyes lighted on the table beside the corpse. He reached violently for there neatly piled on the scrubbed wooden surface he could see kidneys, breast, and a heart. So that was the murder of Mary. Before we get into the letters from hell, which are the Jack the Ripper letters, I would like to let you all know that there are other episodes that I've done on Jack the Ripper. When I finish the series, I'll put out a playlist so you guys can just if you want, listen to each one right after each other, or you're welcome to look through the older episodes and find them. But yeah, I think this is like part 4 or 5 in the Jack the Ripper series. But yeah, we'll get on to the letters from hell, the Jack the Ripper letters. Here's the first letter. Dear Boss, I keep hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. The joke about the leather apron gives me the real fits. I'm down on whores and I shan't stop ripping them till I do get buckled. Grand work, the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work and I want to start again. You will soon hear of me and my funny little games. The next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ears off and send them to the police, just for jolly. Wouldn't you? Jack the Ripper. Beneath the signature was added, Don't mind me giving the trade name. Wasn't good enough to post this before I got all the red ink off my hands. Curse it. No luck yet. They still say I'm a doctor now. Ha ha! Among the thousands of Ripper-related letters that were sent to the police, the Vigilance Committee, or the London Hospital, this letter stands out. The postmark showed that it had been posted in East London on September 28th, 2 days before the murder of Catherine Eddowes. The date fixes clearly that the reference to mutilation of the ears, it hadn't happened before, was part of the program. A chance guess on that part of a crank? Perhaps, but written 2 days before a murder in which the victim's ears had been slashed off. The name Jack the Ripper started at this point, assuming that the writer and the murderer are one and the same. The invention of the name that has gone down in history must be accorded to the murderer himself. The letter had been addressed to The Boss, Central News Office, London City, and was published in The Times on October the 3rd. Meanwhile, the CNA had received the following postcard, postmarked September 30th. Here's another letter. I was not codding, dear boss, when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jack's work tomorrow. Double event this time. Number 1 squealed a bit. Couldn't finish straight off. Had no time to get the ears for police. Thanks for keeping the last letter back till I go back to work again. Jack the Ripper. In his book, The Identity of Jack the Ripper, Donald McCormick pointed out that this was a Sunday and nothing was published until a day later. The East End would have been awash with rumor, but the writer knew so many specifics. Was the squeal he referred to the same stifled cry heard by the Stride inquest witness, Mrs. Mortimer? There had been an attempt to remove the ears. The reference to as yet unpublished letter also gives grounds for supposing this to be genuine. Police checked the possibility that a pressman, perhaps the CNA, might have written the second letter with knowledge of the first, but they found no proof. It was shortly after this that the portion of the kidney, accompanied by a letter, was sent to Mr. Lusk. One of the problems facing the police was the sheer volume of correspondence from far and wide. It was as if half the population was bent on sending practical jokes, or well-meant but half-baked ideas, to the authorities. Letters were arriving from overseas, newspaper clippings of sightings and confessions came from with every post, and the meager administrative resources of Scotland Yard were strained to break point. The Yard took the unprecedented step of printing a ready-made acknowledgment letter, which relieved some of the work, but precious manpower and time still had to be spent sifting the information. In the midst of the postal avalanche came one letter bearing the royal crest. Queen Victoria was known not to suffer fools gladly, and the aging monarch, she was 69, expressed a shrewd knowledge of what was happening just 3 miles east of Buckingham Palace. This, I guess, is the Queen's letter. The Queen fears that the detective department is not so efficient as it might be. No doubt the recent murders in Whitechapel were committed in circumstances which made detection very difficult. Still, the Queen thinks that, in the small area where these horrible crimes have been perpetrated, a great number of detectives might be employed, and that every possible suggestion might be carefully examined and, if practicable, followed. Have the cattle boats and passenger boats been examined? Has any investigation been made as to the number of the single men occupying rooms to themselves? The murderer's clothes must have been saturated with blood and kept somewhere. Is there sufficient surveillance at night? These are some of the questions that occur to the Queen on reading the accounts of these horrible crimes. The Home Secretary's office unofficial reaction can only be guessed at. What is certain is that more pressure was put on Warren and his men. The astute suggestion about shipping movements caused meticulous checks to be carried out, especially on the monthly cattle boats that usually docked just before a weekend and left again on Sundays. The fact that the killings had taken place at weekends and that most crew would include a butcher had not escaped the monarch. This letter from Buckingham Palace throws an interesting and paradoxical light on the aged Queen, so often pictured as a black-costumed widow, a semi-recluse. Queen had clearly spent time pondering the moves of the mysterious murderer. These pertinent comments on the crimes make it far more likely that each new account was devoured with Her Majesty's morning toast, and that the royal marmalade was more than once spilled on the lurid woodcuts that adorned the weekly illustrated police news. The newspapers did their best to keep their readers informed, though one wonders how much reassurance the readers of the Daily Telegraph would have gained from this report of the measures taken for their well-being. Shortly before midnight, the assassin hunters are dispatched upon their mission. Their footfall is silenced by the use of galoshes, and their safety is assured by carrying of police whistles and stout sticks. Newspaper editors were kept busy with a torrent of readers' comments. Disguise your officers as women. armored plated collars to be knife-proof, electric alarm bells in every street, mechanical man-traps in female form, whose spring-loaded arms seize the suspect while the machine declares its triumph by loud blast on a police whistle. These are the ideas, I guess, from the editor comments. Contemporary ripperologist Dr. A. Forbes Winslow suggested an advertisement in the personal column. This would be the advertisement. Gentlemen who is strongly opposed to presence of a fallen woman in the streets of London would like to cooperate with someone with a view to their suppression. Not that all the readers were amateur sleuths. Some kept their comments to sociological matters. The rector of St. Jude's Church, Commercial Street, Reverend Samuel Barnett, wanted brothels to be purchased by philanthropists and converted into homes and night refuges. 10 days after the double murder, Reverend R.C. Bedford, Bishop Suffrage for East London, wrote to the Times. He had been rector of Spitalfields and was writing to protest at this well-meant suggestion. Quote, "Another night refuge is not required. It would attract more of these women into the neighborhood and increase the difficulties of the situation. But what is needed is a home where washing and other work could be done and where poor women who are really anxious to lead a better life could find employment. There are penitentiaries and mission houses into which the younger women can be received. The public generally are little aware of how much good work is being done of late among these. But for the older women, many of whom have only taken to their miserable mode of earning a living in sheer despair and who would gladly renounce it, we have not the home. It is of the utmost importance one should be provided. It would defer them from the ordinary penitentiary. £2,000 would enable the experiment to be tried, and I have no doubt at all of it being a success." The bishop went on to offer to conduct such a home and ask that volunteer ladies with charitable intentions should contact him. Quote, "It is my bounden duty to use my position and experience to turn the best account the painful interest that has been excited by late events in the East End." The letters column in the Times was bursting. From the Bishopsgate Rectory, and Reverend William Rogers suggested that prostitutes should be licensed. Quote, "I know the cry that will be raised against this, but I ask, are there interests of society to be sacrificed for a blatant prudery? Once registered, the women could be visited and attempts made to redeem them." Unquote. While willing to undertake these house calls himself, Reverend Rogers conceded that his position might this task open to critical comment. Clergy was not alone. Eminent dramatic critic, socialist, and tireless newspaper letter writer George Bernard Shaw commented in the Star, quote, "Sir, will you allow me to make a comment on the success of the Whitechapel murderer in calling attention for a moment to the social question? Less than a year ago, the West End press were literally clamoring for the blood of the people, hounding on Sir Charles Warren to thrash and muzzle the scum who dared to complain that they were starving. Quite lost on these journals were indignant remonstrances, arguments, speeches, and sacrifices, appeals to history, philosophy, biology, economics, and statistics, investigations into the condition of the unemployed, all unanswered and all unanswerable. The press was still, frankly, for hanging the appellants. Now all is changed. Private enterprise has succeeded where socialism failed, whilst we conventionally social democrats were wasting our times on education, agitation, and organization. Some independent genius has taken the matter in hand, and by simply murdering and disaboweling 4 women, converted the proprietary press into an inept sort of communism. The moral is pretty. is a pretty one. Dynamitards and anarchists will not be slow to draw it. Quote, humanity, political science, economics and religion, unquote, they will say, are all rot. The one argument that touches your lady and gentlemen is the knife. The dock strike riots of 1886 brought in £78,000 and a people's palace. It remains to be seen how much of these murders may prove worth to the East End. Indeed, if the habits of the Duchess only admitted of their being decoyed into Whitechapel backyards, a single experiment in slaughterhouse anatomy on an aristocratic victim might bring in around $500,000 and save the necessity of sacrificing 4 women of the people. The Ripper murders were certainly spotlighting social problems in the East End and the appalling social divide between rich and poor. The remarkable statement made by the foreman of the jury at the inquest on Polly Nichols was to be heard on many lips. He had complained, quote, if it had been a rich person that was murdered, there would have been a reward for £1,000 offered. But as it was only a poor unfortunate, hardly any notice was taken. I will myself give £25 for the capture of the murderer. On November 16th, after the Kelly murder, a Times editorial reported the public reproofs that had been poured on by police. It had called on the community to assist the police and commented, quote, there's much more profitable occupation than vague, windy abuse of people who cannot create evidence. Deep searching of hearts, humiliation of spirit, and sorrowful reflection over the causes which make these unspeakable atrocities possible would be more seemingly cheap and declamation about the shortcomings of the police. Others soon took up the cry. A petition was sent to the Queen by Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, entreating her to offer a reward for the capture of the killer. The Home Secretary steadfastly refused to become involved in payments. But the Lord Mayor of London and the aldermen in the square mile jurisdiction of the city had no such reservations and, following the Eddowes murder, published the following notice. Whereas at 1:45 a.m. on Sunday, September 30th, a woman, name unknown, was found brutally murdered in Mitre Square, Aldgate, in this city. A reward for £500 will be paid by the Commissioner of Police of the City of London to any such person, other than a person belonging to the police forces of the United Kingdom, who shall give such information as shall lead to the discovery and the conviction of the murderer or murderers. Information to be given to the Inspector of the Detective Department, 26, Old Jewry, on any police station. Private offers of rewards came from many quarters. The Financial News, at the behest of its readers, wrote to the Home Secretary, quote, in view of your refusal to offer a reward out of government funds for the discovery of the perpetrator or perpetrators of the recent murders in the East End of London, I am instructed on behalf of several readers of the Financial News, whose names and addresses I enclose, to forward to you the accompanying check of £300, and to request you to offer that sum for this purpose in the name of the government. The Home Office, returning the check, replied, if Mr. Matthews had been of the opinion that the offer of the reward in these cases would have been attended by any useful result, he would himself have at once made such an offer. But he is not of that opinion. Under these circumstances, I am directed to return to you the check which I enclose, and to thank you and the gentleman for the liberality of the offer, which Mr. Matthews much regrets he is unable to accept. The prompt action of the Lord Mayor had been received with general satisfaction. The city reward then added up to £400 offered by 2 newspapers, £100 from Mr. Montague Hall, MP, and 200 pounds collected by the Vigilance Committee put a price at 1,200 pounds on the killer's head. If a century later we add 2 knots to this figure, some idea of the enormity of the reward can be measured. The Lord Mayor had been urged to open a subscription list, and even the normally self-occupied and imperturbable members of the stock exchange had seemed disposed to take up the matter. Newspaper readers had again been treated to a demonstration of division within the authorities. While this wrangling was taking place, Jack's own pen was still busy. Here's the next letter from Jack the Ripper. From hell, Mr. Lusk. Sir, I send you half the kidney I took from the one woman preserved for you together. Peace. I fried it and ate it. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out if you only wait a while longer. Signed, Catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk. 13 days later, on October 29th, a letter was sent to the doctor who had examined the kidney. Oh, boss, you write it was the left kidney. I was going to operate again close to your hospital. Just as I was going to drop my knife along off her bloomin' throat, them cusses of coppers spoilt the game. But I guess I'll be on the job soon and we'll send you another bit of innards. Jack the Ripper. P.S. Oh, have you seen the Delve with his microscope and scalpel looking at a kidney with a slide cocked up? The fanaticism of this missive predated by some 40 years the peculiar notion of Hollywood's scriptwriters when creating Cockney speech for the movies in the 1930s. It also prompted the authorities to look for clues to the identity of the writer, which his spelling and use of certain words might reveal. The second postcard sent to the chairman of the Vigilance Committee rated particular attention. Here's another letter. Say, boss, you seem rare frightened. Guess I like give you fits, but can't stop long enough to let you box of toys play copper games with me. But hope to see you when I don't hurry too much. Goodbye, boss. The use of the slang such as quit, rare, frightened, and codding led the Times to conclude that the writer was American. Other correspondents pointed out that codding appeared in the Oxford English Dictionary and had been used for centuries as a low reference to hoax or joking. Shakespeare, said another, could scarcely have been accused of Americanism in his apparent preoccupation with codpieces. Another letter he mentioned buckled, and many observed that this was common London underworld slang for arrest. There was a conjecture that the box of toys was a nautical term or simply Cockney rhyming slang for boys. The debate went on and on. Jack didn't just taunt from the capital. A letter posted in Liverpool and received on September 29th, a day before the double murder, said, Beware, I shall be at work on the 1st and 2nd. In the Minories, at 12 midnight, and I give the authorities a good chance, but there is never policeman near when I'm at work. This was followed by a note bearing the address Prince William Street, Liverpool, with, What fools the police are. I even gave them the name of the street where I am living. From Glasgow, Jack goaded. Think, I'll quit using my nice sharp knife, too good for whores. Have come here to buy a Scotch dirk. Ha ha! That will tickle up their ovaries. Dr. Thomas Dutton, a specialist in microphotography, had made more than 100 comparison microscopic slides of the letters. At least 34, which, by the way, if you're watching on YouTube, you can see the letters and at least one of them as an example. Dutton claimed to have photographed the message scrawled on the wall in Gulston Street, and that was mentioned in a previous episode. The no Jews will be blamed for this, the whole Freemason connection. Dutton had claimed to photograph the message scrawled on the wall in Gulston Street before it had been erased, but said that Sir Charles Watson had destroyed the prints, which had sent to the police. Subsequent graphologists have pointed to the similarities of "From Hell" and the Old Boss letters. Sharp angles and dagger strokes apparently indicate extreme tension, finding a vent in anger, and latent homosexuality was hinted at by the loops beneath the lines being returned on the wrong side of the letter. In his memoirs, Dutton's, for many years a leading figure in Chichester and West Sussex Microscopic Society, judged the police as having paid too little attention to the letters. They had assumed that several hoaxers were at work and had ignored the fact that 34 were in the same hand, and these contained significant information. Under the pen name Nemo, a writer who had lived in India suggested that the mutilations indicated that they had been committed by a Malay, Lascar, or other Asiatic. Quote, "Unless caught red-handed, Nemo's phraseology was chillingly apt. Such a man in ordinary life would be harmless enough, polite, not to say obsequious in his manners, and about the last a British policeman would suspect. But when the villain is primed with his opium or bang or gin and inspired with his lust for slaughter and blood, he would destroy his defenseless victim with the ferocity and the cunning of the tiger, and past impunity and success would only have rendered him the more daring and reckless." Somewhat less histrionically, Fred W. P. Jago of Plymouth wrote to the Times on October 4th, quote, "Sir, another remarkable letter has been written by some bad fellow who signs himself Jack the Ripper. The letter is said to be smeared with blood, and there is on the print, in blood, of the corrugated surface of a thumb. This may be that of a man or a woman. It is inconceivable that a woman wrote or smeared such a letter, and therefore it may be accepted as a fact that the impression in the blood is that of a man's thumb. The surface of a thumb so printed is as clearly indicated as are printed letters from any kind of type. Thus there is a possibility of identifying the blood print on the letter with the thumb that made it, because the surface markings on two thumbs are alike, and this a low-power microscope could reveal." Mr. Jago went on to suggest that the test may be made to see it was human blood, and that the thumbs of the suspects compared with the print, thumb size and class of the hand would also need to be considered. Quote, "All this the microscope could reveal. The print of the thumb would give as good evidence as that of a boot or shoe." The suggestion, in fact, predated the use of fingerprints by the police by more than a decade. In 1901, fingerprinting would be sanctioned in England and Wales. By 1905, the Metropolitan Police, who supervised the system, would have 80,000 prints on record and would be adding about 350 slips weekly. In that year, the first conviction would be obtained using the bloody fingerprint evidence found at a murder with robbery in Deptford, South London. But that was a generation away, and fingerprints played no part for Inspector Aberline and his men. The apparent disinterest shown by the police may have sprung simply from the sheer volume of the correspondence. Sifting just over a score of similar-looking notes from thousands of letters was too mammoth a task to contemplate. Besides the ill-spelled letter that had accompanied the kidney sent to Mr. Lusk, had been scrawled untidily and almost maniacally, whereas the Jack the Ripper signatures were in the neat copper plate of an educated correspondent who had no spelling difficulties. But it is to be supposed that the maniacal killer under stress would write in the same style as in his calmer moments? The police thought so, but perhaps nobody had told Jack. Just to compound the difficulties, Jack went on writing, Cards simply addressed to the boss, Scotland Yard, would arrive with a penciled annotation by alert postal sorters about time and place of posting. That some of the boastful exhibitionist letters were genuine, there can be little doubt, for Jack, the ultimate exhibitionist, the letters are entirely in character. But it is not for his writing that Jack has gone down in history. Blood was Jack's ink, a flashing blade his pen.
We are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret society, opposed to secret oaths, opposed to secret proceedings, secret proceedings. No official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know.